Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Plato and Atlantis. Atlantis is an extremely controversial subject. It's a subject that fuels many theories, more or less realistic, more or less credible. It's also a subject that fuels perplexity, not to say mockery, because for historians Atlantis never existed. It's a legend, at best a mythical tale, but not a historical reality. For others, on the contrary, Atlantis really did exist, or at least the hypothesis remains open, and this hypothesis has its origins in Plato. It was Plato who first put forward the idea that an island called Atlantis had been home to a civilization that preceded our own, the Atlanteans. According to him, these Atlanteans possessed a superior level of knowledge and technology. Of course, Plato was no historian, but neither was he a poet. In ancient times, those who wrote myths were called poets, like Homer, Hesiod, and Chill. Plato wasn't a poet, he was a philosopher, and when he talks about Atlantis, he makes it clear that he's talking about something real. In other words, he doesn't present the story of Atlantis as a myth. The trouble is, this goes completely against the official version of history. According to this version, no civilization preceded us because no traces have been found. If we did have traces, we could envisage another civilization having existed before us, but in this case, we've got nothing. We've got nothing. Some dispute this view, basing their argument on the existence of vestiges and monuments that could not have been built by the men of our current civilization. At the time they were built, we didn't have the technical and industrial skills to build such monuments. The pyramids of Giza, for example, are shrouded in mystery. So for some, these monuments are the work of the Atlanteans, a technologically advanced civilization that disappeared in a gigantic cataclysm, a deluge, a civilization that possessed a degree of wisdom and knowledge far superior to any other, but which over time became so corrupted that God himself caused it to disappear into the waters. Well, all that comes from Plato. Now, this is not a history or archaeology channel, so we're not going to comment on the historical reality of Atlantis. Instead, we're going to ask ourselves what the story of Atlantis can offer us philosophically. Because whether Atlantis is a reality or not, Plato's description of it does give us food for thought. A reflection on what we are, and a reflection on the nature of the universe. So what can Atlantis teach us about the world and about ourselves? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. Plato tells us about Atlantis in two texts, the Critias and the Timaeus. The Critias relates the testimony of a friend of his grandfather, a certain Solon, one of the 7 sages of Greece, who, during a visit to Egypt, was informed by priests of the existence of an ancient civilization called Atlantis. These priests explained to him that 9,000 years earlier, there had been a war between Athens and Atlantis. So, 9,000 years earlier, we don't understand because 9,000 years earlier, Athens wasn't supposed to exist. Well, the Egyptian priests told Solon that the Greeks had existed for much longer, but that they had forgotten their history, forgotten their past. And one of them even told him this very enigmatic phrase, "You Greeks are still children." So as I understand it, he asks the priest, "What do you mean?" And the priest replies, "At regular intervals, civilizations are destroyed by great cataclysms, either by fire or by water. 9,000 years ago, Atlantis disappeared because of a flood of such power that the continent of Atlantis was swallowed up. And this flood didn't just happen at any time, it came just after a war between the Atlantean and Athenian armies. Its engulfment, therefore, has all the hallmarks of a punishment. And it's not me saying it, it's the Egyptian priest. He tells us that floods are divine purifications. We immediately think of the floods in the Bible, where God sees that the human beings he has created are violent and corrupt, and decides to exterminate his own creation. Well, in the case of the Atlanteans, it would seem to be exactly the same thing. In the beginning, the Atlanteans were a virtuous civilization, a harmonious civilization, and over the generations, the Atlanteans became executives. They lost their virtue. They were won over by what the Greeks call hubris, greed. And this greed caused their downfall, leading in the process to the extinction of Greek civilization. So there's a lot to take away from this story, but for the sake of explanation, let's focus on 3. The first, which concerns Greece rather than Atlantis, is the notion of memory. The priest tells Solon, The Greeks have lost their memory, and because they've lost their memory, they've had to relearn everything. A civilization is an inheritance. More precisely, a civilization constantly relies on an inheritance. A historical inheritance, a cultural inheritance, a technological inheritance. You, for example, are part of a civilization whose knowledge and technologies you use. And of course, these technologies have only been developed because they are based on earlier technologies. For example, computing is a technology that stems from both mathematics and electronics. And before electronics, there was mechanics. For example, Pascal's 17th century calculating machine. And before calculating machines, there were abacuses. We didn't invent computer algorithms straight away. There were stages, long stages. Why do I say all this? To make you understand that a civilization relies entirely on the faculty of memory, and that forgetting is synonymous with the disappearance of a civilization. If we were to wake up tomorrow and all of us had amnesia, our civilization would collapse, and we'd have to learn everything all over again. Memory is what means we don't have to relearn everything. It's what means we can build on what civilization has bequeathed us. Rabelais famously said, "We are dwarfs on the shoulders of giants." The giants are the history that preceded us and the memory of that history. Today, we delegate our memory to computers. Suppose a cataclysm were to break the mainframe. Well, we wouldn't be too proud, because then the technological heart of our civilizational memory would disappear. We'd have to start all over again. What the Egyptian priest says to Solon is that this is exactly what happened to the Athenians after the flood. All their knowledge disappeared. That's why the Athenians have no memory of their war against Atlantis, and that's why the Egyptian priest says the Greeks are still children. There are no old men in Greece. The old man is the one with the fullest memory, the heaviest hard drive. This is why wisdom is traditionally represented by old age, the old age of the person who has lived and has the memory of what he has lived. The priest adds that the difference between the Greeks and the Egyptians is that the Egyptians have not lost their memory. They know their past. So why them and not the Greeks? Because, says the priest, Egypt has been spared the cataclysms due to its geographical location, and more specifically, the Nile. Here's what he says. There has often been, there will often be again, destruction of men caused in various ways, the greatest by fire and water, and others lesser. Among other things, the bodies that circulate in the sky around the earth deviate from their course, and a great conflagration that occurs at great intervals destroys what is on the surface of the earth. Then all those who dwell in the mountains and in high and arid places perish, rather than those who dwell by the rivers and the sea. We have the Nile, our ordinary savior, who in Perica preserves us from this calamity by its overflows. When, on the contrary, the gods submerge the earth under water to purify it, the mountain dwellers, herdsmen, and priests escape death. But those who live in your cities are swept away by the rivers into the sea, whereas with us, neither in this case nor in others, does the water ever rush down from the heights into the countryside. On the contrary, it naturally always rises to the bottom. This is how and why we are said to have preserved the oldest traditions. Also, everything beautiful, great, or remarkable in any other respect, whether in your country or here or in any other country we've heard of, is recorded here in writing in our temples from time immemorial. And so it is with you, on the contrary, and with other peoples. No sooner are you provided with writing and all that is necessary for cities, than again, after the ordinary interval of time, tornadoes from the sky descend upon you like a disease and leave only the illiterate and ignorant to survive, so that you find yourselves back where you started, like young people knowing nothing of what happened in ancient times, either here or among you. So now you understand, I think, how civilization is inseparable from the notion of memory, and how forgetting is synonymous with the disappearance of a civilization, and possibly its rebirth. And this brings us to the second thing we need to remember about the story of Atlantis, which is degeneration. Degeneration is when an organism or society degenerates, and degeneration literally means losing rank. Degeneration is decadence. And the cause of degeneration, according to Plato, is corruption. The corruption inherent in human beings, the corruption that leads them down a kind of aging slope. I've already done an episode on corruption in Plato, in which we saw that corruption is not only a moral phenomenon, but also a physical and metaphysical law. Human beings are beings of flesh, and as beings of flesh, they are subject to desires, sensual desires, material desires. And so, corruption is the hallmark of being subject to material desires. This is what we find in Christianity with what we call the sin of the flesh, temptation, symbolized by Satan, whose aim is to make us descend into matter. If hell is located at the center of the earth, it's because it's the lowest and at the same time densest, most compact place, in contrast to paradise, which is located in the beyond, where gravity no longer exists. So, man is a being of flesh. Because he is flesh, he is subject to temptation. And when his virtue falters, in other words, when human behavior begins to be infiltrated by desires other than the desire for virtue, corruption sets in. So to return to the Atlanteans, Christianity tells us that this people degenerated, that they allowed themselves to fall into corruption, all the more so because they forgot their origins. But these origins are divine. Christianity tells us that in ancient times, the gods divided up the different regions of the earth. Greece was ruled by Hephaestus and Athena. Atlantis had Poseidon as king. Poseidon had 10 children with a mortal woman, 5 of them twins. So he divided Atlantis into 10 and entrusted each of the 10 parts of the island to one of his 10 sons. The first was called Atlas, hence the name given to Atlantis. And things went wonderfully well. The island produced everything needed for survival. Fertile land, fruit in abundance, animals of all kinds, and even precious metals. The Atlanteans soon built temples, palaces, and harbors. When it came to architecture, the Atlanteans did very well. They built stone constructions in alchemical colors, white, black, and red. The royal palace is surrounded by a golden wall, and the island has an excellent army. On the religious front, Atlanteans do what they have to do. The gods are worshipped, sacrifices are made, and prescriptions are respected. So you might say, all's well with the Atlanteans, no decadence on the horizon. No, not at first. It happened over time. In the beginning, the Atlanteans were guided by virtue, by justice, by harmony. Then, after a while, something happened. They began to forget. Forget what? To forget their divine origin. To forget that they were a noble people, a wise people. A people not interested in objects of temptation, riches, pleasure, excess. See, we're back on the subject of memory. A corrupt people is one that has lost its memory, the memory of its origins. Another way of saying that the cause of degeneration is running away. So the more time passes, the further Atlanteans move away from their divine essence, i.e. their original purity. And the rest indicates that the main cause of their corruption was interbreeding with humans. So this is not racism, but rather speciesism. The human species is considered less pure than the divine species. That's understandable. We humans are closer to animals. We have physiological needs. Remember that in Greek mythology, the gods feed on ambrosia, that is, food that makes you immortal, while we are mortal. From the gods' point of view, our life is more akin to survival. We're mortal, our body is mortal, and it's because our body is mortal that it's attracted by the pleasures of this world, sensuality, excitement, enjoyment. This is precisely what makes us feel alive. The gods are not about enjoyment, they are about neutrality, about balance. Human beings embody this, but not balance. They embody the negative, i.e. need, desire, and lack. So the Atlanteans, who were initially very virtuous, gradually degenerated. Forced to reproduce with human beings, they began to act contrary to divine principles. They learned to become ambitious, proud, and envious. They confused happiness with pleasure until they declared war on Athens, a war they lost before the island sank. Now, there's a real question to be asked about the fact that the sinking of Atlantis was due to both a natural cataclysm and divine punishment. Because that's weird. Why is it weird? Because the Egyptian priest said that cataclysms were regular. He spoke of an ordinary interval of time, as if cataclysms were finally part of natural cycles, as if the great cosmic conflagration was foreseen in the astronomical laws themselves. Indeed, in Plato's Timaeus, he speaks of a cosmic cycle that he calls the Great Year, and estimates at 25,920 years. He calls it the Great Year, because it's the time it takes for a constellation to make a complete turn on itself. This Great Year is divided into 12 months, each month lasting 2,160 years, and is what we now call the zodiacs. A zodiac is a cosmic month. And so the idea that goes with this is that at the end of a cycle, we're entitled to a cataclysm, a flood, or a holocaust. Remember that holocaust means sacrifice by fire, and Christians call it apocalypse, which also means revelation. So if we take all these elements into account, we have the idea that the disappearance of Atlantis was due to a cataclysm that was part of a cosmic cycle, and that this cosmic cycle corresponds at the same time to a decadence, at the end of which the civilization deserves to be destroyed. And if that's what we need to understand, then it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Because it would mean that the macrocosm and the microcosm are linked, that they evolve in parallel. Let's go even further. That moral degradation is a consequence of cosmic movement, that moral degradation and cosmic movement are the same thing, and that the further cosmic movement moves the constellations away from their alpha point, the further the human heart moves away from its alpha point, i.e. its origin, its divine origin. In non-religious language, we'd say from its principial origin. Decadence, then, is simply distance from the principle, and the further we move away from the principle, the more civilization materializes. In other words, the more it submits to the logic of the body and forgets the logic of the spirit that is the domain of the gods. The spirit, said Plato, is the divine part of man. So over time, the divine part begins to fade, we fall into degeneration, and it's only at the end of the cycle of degeneration that the earth will be purified by fire or water. So the question is, can we avoid falling into degeneration? Can we perhaps not cancel the cycle, but at least ensure that we stay close to the principles for the duration of a cycle? Quite simply, this is the third point to be retained from the story of Atlantis, namely the harmonious society. Plato wrote a text called the Republic, in which he explains firstly that man's quest is happiness, and secondly that happiness derives from a harmonious society. What is a harmonious society? A harmonious society is one organized according to universal principles. And universal principles are those that can be deduced from universal laws. I'm talking here about physical laws, astronomical laws, and even mathematics, especially the mathematics of Plato, as of Pythagoras before him. The universe is organized by numbers. A number is not just an abstraction, it's a cosmic reality, an invisible reality, but a reality that manifests itself in visible phenomena, cycles. So, what Plato is saying is that society must be organized in accordance with the principles that govern the universe, always based on the idea that principles guarantee balance. Now, there's a theory that Plato uses to explain how society should be organized. This theory is the theory of the four elements. The theory of the four elements was first put forward by Empedocles in the 5th century BC. What he tells us is that these four elements are at the origin of everything that exists in the universe. You know these four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. So, according to Empedocles, the matter that makes up the universe is a mixture of these four elements. But what does this have to do with the organization of society? Well, I'll come to that. Each element is associated with a social class. The element earth corresponds to the class of producers. Why producers? Because producers ensure the satisfaction of material needs, i.e. earthly needs. Plowmen are those who work the land, and from the land comes food, hence the needs of the body. What's more, the earth element refers to the temperaments of producers: hardness, roughness, resistance. So there's an analogical link between the earth element and the producer class. The water element corresponds to the warrior class. Why warriors? Because water represents fluidity, mobility, and adaptability. Water insinuates itself into the smallest nooks and crannies, spreading over the entire surface. When we say that an army rushes towards the enemy, it conjures up the image of liquefaction, of something flowing. And when an army invades a territory, it's a tidal wave. So the water element corresponds to the warrior class. The air element corresponds to the intellectual class, because air is thought. Air evaporates, and in ancient times, wings represented the spirit, because the spirit allows us to rise above matter. With this idea of altitude, of height, as when we say that through thought we gain height over things. Plato spoke of the good of the sky of ideas. The intellectual is the one who evolves in the sphere of ideas. And finally, the element of fire. Well, the element of fire is the superior element, the element of kings. In Plato's view, the city should be governed by philosophers, that is, by people who possess wisdom and virtue, who possess a sense of justice. For Plato, justice is the cardinal virtue from which all other virtues flow. Moreover, you'll have noticed that the king is often associated with the figure of fire, as was the case in France with Louis XIV, the Sun King. So here we have a social stratification analogous to natural stratification with an idea of hierarchy. Earth is the lowest element because it's the heaviest, so it's what naturally tends downwards. The elemental symbol is a downward-pointing triangle. Water is an element that also tends downwards, but due to its fluid nature has a tendency to disperse. As we've said, water spreads, taking on the shape of its container. The symbol for the element water is a downward-pointing triangle with a line through it. Air is a floating element. It's above what's on the ground, earth and water, and it envelops them, so to speak, just as thought envelops matter. It encompasses. Inflating a balloon with helium will enable it to go down as well as up. The symbol for the element air is a pointing triangle. And finally, the element of fire. Fire naturally tends upwards. A flame rises. It's strange when you think about it, an element that spreads upwards. Fire represents ascent, transcendence, and life. The symbol for the element fire is a triangle pointing upwards. As it happens, the hierarchy of the elements is respected in the composition of the Earth. If we look at the surface area of the Earth's continents, we see that it's around 30%. While 70% of the Earth's surface is made up of water, the seas and oceans, we have first the Earth, then the water that envelops both the Earth and the water itself. The air represents the atmosphere, where atmos means vapor. The atmosphere is literally a sphere of vapor surrounding the Earth. So we have earth, water, air, and fire. Fire represents the sun, which not only towers above the other elements, but is also much larger than the Earth. The diameter of the sun is 109 times that of the Earth, so we have earth, water, air, and fire. And if we go further within the living world, we also find the hierarchy of elements. The elemental represents the mineral. The element O represents the vegetable. The plant feeds on water. The element R represents the animal. Animals are linked to breath. And finally, the element fire represents the divine of which we said earlier that the human being is a part. So you can see that behind this theory, which may seem a little vague at first glance, we do have a symbolism and an organization. Plato tells us that this organization, this cosmic hierarchy, must be transposed into society. Society must reflect universal principles, according to the idea that the microcosm must mirror the macrocosm to maintain balance. And this is where Plato's conception of the human soul comes into sharper focus. For him, the soul is the microcosm, the miniaturized reflection of the universal order. For Plato, the soul is divided into 3 parts. Each of these parts corresponds to an element and, by extension, to a social class. The lower part of the soul is what Plato calls the epitumera. This is the part of the soul that corresponds to physiological needs, to the body's needs, i.e. the belly and the lower abdomen. It therefore corresponds to the producer class. Pitumiant represents both the need for food and sexual desire. Food is the condition for individual survival, and sexual desire is the condition for collective survival, as it enables us to have children to perpetuate the species. Epitumians are linked to the earth element. The intermediate part of the soul is the tumos, symbolizing courage and ardor. This is the part of the soul that corresponds to the warrior class. If epitumia corresponds to the belly, tumos corresponds to the heart. Indeed, heart and courage are etymologically linked. Thus, the warrior is the one with the heart, because he protects the city and shows courage. Here, we leave the sphere of the body and matter to enter the sphere of feeling. Tumos is the element that represents the upper part of the soul. It is the logos, which gave rise to the word logic. The logos is the intellectual part of the soul, through which we come into contact with the world of ideas. It represents the head, and is therefore the part of the soul that must have ascendancy over the others. The head is the one that must command, which gave rise to decapitated, and which also gave rise to captain, the one who commands. In the Phaedrus, Plato uses the metaphor of a team of horses. He explains that the epitumion and the tumos are like two horses and that the logos is the driver of the class. Reason must master the passions. Logos is the R element. So one element is missing, the fire element. The fire element represents the harmony of the three parts. It's the unity of the three parts. It's the balance between desires, will, and reason. This balance is found in cosmic organization, which is why the ancients attached great importance to the notion of harmony. For harmony is both order and beauty. Beauty is the reflection of order. Harmony signifies adjustment between parts. It signifies unity. Indeed, the word cosmos etymologically means order. Order is the unity of the multiple. And for Plato, the city must strive for this unity. It is wrongly said that in the Republic, Plato describes the ideal city. It's not the ideal city, it's the beautiful city, Kellipolis. Beautiful because it's harmonious. Harmonious because it's orderly, because it's just. For Plato, the true, the good, and the beautiful merge in harmony. And men will be all the more just and virtuous if the society in which they live is itself just and virtuous. The universe, society, and the soul are the three localities of cosmic harmony, and on their adjustment depends the balance of the world. So these are the three things to remember about Atlantis: memory, degeneration, and universal harmony. The Atlanteans forgot the cosmic order. By forgetting cosmic order, their civilization lost its harmony and fell into decadence, into imbalance, and this imbalance proved fatal. When balance is no longer respected, the penalty is annihilation. I quote, "Such was the formidable power that then existed in this land, and which God assembled and turned against our country, for the following reason. For many generations, as long as the nature of the god made itself sufficiently felt in them, they obeyed the laws and remained attached to the divine principle to which they were related. They had only true and great thoughts in every respect, and behaved with gentleness and wisdom in the face of all life's hazards, and towards each other as well. Paying attention only to virtue, they cared little for their property, and easily bore the burden that was for them the mass of their gold and other possessions. They were not intoxicated by the pleasures of wealth, and never strayed from their duties. Temperate as they were, they clearly saw that all these possessions were increased by mutual affection united to virtue, and that if one attached oneself to them and honored them, it could result in their own loss, as well as that of virtue. As long as they reasoned in this way and kept their divine nature, they saw all good things grow. We'll never know what God said to the god, but we can hypothesize. The hypothesis that immediately comes to mind. It's that, faced with the degeneracy of the Atlanteans, the gods decided to wipe out Atlantis, to restore balance to the world by removing a cause of imbalance. In our minds, exterminating a civilization doesn't seem very compatible with gods embodying balance, because for us, the balance of the gods would be a kind of benevolence tinged with paternalism. And that's a naive vision of balance, a human vision of balance. On a cosmic scale, balance also requires sacrifice, the sacrifice of that which compromises balance. The cosmos is pragmatic. Catastrophes are part of the natural order, bad weather, disease, viruses, and we too are part of the natural order. But it may be that if we create too many imbalances, if we disturb the natural order of which we are a part a little too much, the punishment will be dreadful. And if that day comes, we won't have to blame God. We'll have to blame ourselves for failing to maintain harmony. And for those who survive, to learn from it and pass it on. Because man not only passes on life, he also passes on awareness of its value and the means to protect it. Thank you for your kind words.